Hi all, and welcome in. Well, this is episode 4 of this little Panzer.II project, and today we're going to focus in on the pigments. We've got a lot to do again, so let's get going. Well, before jumping straight into working on the model, I thought maybe it might be a good idea just to do a little bit of a brief summary on pigments and some different application methods. Well, by now most of you are already familiar with pigments and probably have used them on numerous occasions. Of course, it kind of stemmed from the older school where people would grind up their own pastel chalks, and then that led to using pigments which are a more pure form of these colors. Well, no real fancy gear here. I'm just using a glass lid and just dropping down some pigments. And what I do is generally add a dark, a mid-tone, and a brighter tone. And then these will get mixed together, and these will become the different variations of colors that I can apply onto my models. Of course, the choice of pigment colors that I would use is just dependent on the type of model and what terrain that the vehicle might be operating in. And so for this little demonstration, what I have is just the bottom of the hull of a T55, an extra hull from that last project. And what I thought I would do is just apply pigments in maybe 4 different methods on the bottom here, just so you can get a little bit of an idea of how different methods act and react and the different types of looks that you can get from it. So in this first section, I'm just applying the pigments dry directly from my dish. And so it's just with a soft brush and I'm putting them in place. The positive thing is that that's very easy. The not so positive thing is not very precise. This next section, I'm going to use the dry pigments, but now I'm adding water to them. And so I call it dissolving them, but in this case I'm dissolving with water. And this will allow me to basically paint the pigments onto the areas that I'd like. Now generally, pigments that are applied with water as the carrier, in this situation, the adhesion or the stickiness to the surface isn't that great, or is less than, say, if I do it with thinner, which will be the next example. But I have to be honest, on this particular little test, these water pigments stuck really, really well. And now in this next section, I'm doing the same thing, but instead of using water, I'm just using, in this case, it's white spirits, but odorless turpentine would be a similar choice. So again, just adding the liquid to the pigments and stirring them up to get a liquid slurry sort of a deal. And this is the method that I prefer mostly when I do my models, using thinners as this application is. And as you can see, I didn't put nearly as much moisture in this cap as I did with the water. And the water I had too much, to be honest with you. So this is more closely represents the type of application process I would do, where it's a little bit finer brush and it's less liquid, and I could just drop the pigments exactly where I want them. And as I said, generally pigments that have thinner as their carrier have a little bit more adhesion to the surface than those that have just water as their carrier. And on this final examples area, I'm going to be using Pigment Fixer. And this method is a really nice, easy way to increase some volume and get kind of that gritty texture that's often very desirable, especially like on the lower holes of our tanks and things like that, where there's going to be a lot of mud and dirt buildup. So what I'm doing is simply dropping pigments onto the surface. So these are dry pigments. I'm just letting drop off the brush onto the model itself. And you get a little bit of volume, get a little bit of thickness with these pigments. And you can see here, I'm kind of changing the colors slightly from time to time too. And then next, once I have some pigment there, I just add a little bit of the fixer, and I do this to the edges because I don't want to disturb the pigments. I want to allow that volume there. I'm not trying to mix the pigments. I just want this fixer to basically saturate the pigments using capillary action. And then regardless of the type of method that you use to apply the pigments, there's always a little bit of editing that can be done. In the case of where the pigments are just, the first example where the pigments were just dry on, that's probably the least editable. Sounds like I'm eating them, because basically the dust is across the entire surface, so it's very difficult to change this. In this area where I had the water, generally that's an easier scrub off, but in this case, for whatever reason, those pigments held pretty good to that location. And then in the area where actually I used the thinner, those were able to edit the most easy. And of course, where I had the fixer, there's no editing possible. One thing you can do, regardless of the type of method, is to go back and continue to work those sections. So in this area where I've added the thinnered pigments, the wet pigments with thinner, I'm just adding a little bit of extra dry pigments. And now again, using that capillary action like I did with the fixer, just go ahead and add a little bit of thinner to the edges and let that just soak in to those pigments and set them in place one more time. And you can even edit this a little bit on the fly if you want to. Same thing with the area where I use the water. I can come back in with the pigments once again with the water as their carrier, and just add a little bit more in the corners to build up a little bit more bulk and volume. And of course, the area with Fixer, that could also be edited and added to. In this case, I'm adding the Fixer first, so I'm flooding the surface with the Fixer, and then adding the dry pigments onto the top, so just once it hits the surface, they're permanently fixed in place. And again, this is just a great way to add some volume and texture, especially, like I said, on areas like road wheels and lower hull. This is a really easy, simple process, and it's very effective. And now that this area is all dried up one more time, you can kind of see how the different types of pigment applications have kind of led to different effects. And finally, the last thing you can do if you'd like is come back in one more time and edit again, remove product if wanted to, or add more. In this case, I've got a clean brush that I'm dipping into thinner, and I'm just kind of scrubbing back some of those areas in the middle of the panel here, because realistically, if this was my vehicle and this was the top of the hull, I'd want my dirt concentrations around the edges and in the nooks and crannies. So that's kind of what I'm doing here. Well, it's probably way past time, and I should stop messing around with this. I hope this little example is a little bit helpful in your own modeling and the use of pigments, showing the different ways the pigments can be applied and the different types of effects that go along with them. Okay, so let's get started here for real. Well, these are the colors I'll be using as I dust up the little Panzer.II here in the desert. Notice how light the lightest color is. It's just a couple shades off of white, and that's important because that little bit of brightness is really going to sell the dust effects over the light colored desert camouflage. So on the lower hull, I'm just using a soft brush. It's an old brush, and I'm just stippling on the colors. And I'm just going to do this in order to get them worked nicely into the surface and build up just a little bit of volume. I'm not trying to make a heavy volume here because it is dust and dirt, not so much mud. And once I have the coverage that I'm looking for here, I'll just add a little bit of odorless thinner to the top edge and let that liquid flow across the surface and set these pigments in place. And while I'm waiting for the thinner to dry on those pigments, I can go ahead and finish up my road wheels and get the tracks ready to install. And again, these are magic tracks, which were assembled earlier. And so now they just need a coat of paint. And for that, I'm just using Tamiya's NATO Black mixed with a little bit of Hull Red, just to give them a dark, rusty appearance. And just to make the installation just a little bit easier, I'll go ahead and glue these drive wheels onto the tracks, and that will just help them fit into place nice and easy. And just like that, we have the lower part of our Panzer all assembled. We have some of the dust behind the wheels and the tracks here. Now it's time to start working on the upper hull. Now as I begin working on the road wheels and especially the upper hull, I'm going to switch back to my preferred method of application, and that's with the pigments dissolved in the odorless thinner. And this way I can be a lot more precise in how and where the pigments are applied onto the model. And luckily, when it counts here on the real model, these pigments are acting much more typically of how I would expect the pigments to react as compared to the demonstration at the beginning of the video. So you can see, even with this soft brush and really soft, easy brush strokes, I'm able to remove the pigment off of areas where I don't want it and move the pigments even towards those recesses, say around the rims of those road wheels. And that light colored pigment for the dust color, well, that's really helping to define, like say, the road wheels between the rubber and the wheels themselves, and really enhances that dusty effect. If there's one thing that I'd like to point out and have everybody keep in mind is, even though now we're working with pigments, and quite honestly, the pigments are the last step in the weathering process, well, a lot of the foundation and a lot of the important work was done in the prior steps. So beginning with the base color and then the camouflage color, then adding the chipping, and then coming back with those oil paints. And especially the oil paints laid some really important foundational colors and dust effects that now with the pigments, we're just looking to enhance all these effects and just kind of tie everything together and really characterize this as a dusty desert vehicle. One of the other real nice benefits of pigments is just their tendency or their ability to stain very well. It's like, pouring water in dirt and you make mud. Same idea here. And in this case, I'm just adding a few stains, like maybe almost like leaking oil or fuel stains, just lightly. I'm not trying to overdo it here, but I can use oil paints, highly thinned, tap around the edge here, and that will just stain those pigments. And it's once the oils here dry, it creates really nice, soft, realistic effects. And once again, if you want deeper, richer effects, more dramatic effects, it can be redone time and time again. But similar how I used the oil paints before, just a little bit of tapping motion with a dry brush just to kind of clean up any excess. And there I go. It's just as simple as that. And again, on this model, I'm trying to keep it a little bit subtle, so I'm not going to stain each of these wheels. Just a couple of the wheels will have a little bit of these extra, I don't know, grease or mud or whatever it might be. But it also gives a little bit of interest, visual interest, and helps with the defining of the road wheels. Moving to the upper hull, it's exactly the same process where in the cup in the background are my pigments, same pigment colors I've been using all along, and they're mixed with odorless thinner, just tapping the pigments where I want them to go. And once again, each of these steps can be redone over and over again to build up more and more effects, more layers of effect. I'm going to continue adding and editing pigments until I get all the way around the model here and get to the appearance that I'm looking for. And so with that, I think I'm about ready to close up shop on this episode. Now, what do we have to look forward to? Well, I do have a couple of figures, and it looks like I'll be probably adding a base to this. So a little diorama base or vignette base with a couple of figures in the next 1 or 2 episodes to look forward to before we move on to a new project. As always, I really appreciate your support, and if you haven't done so already, please hit that like and subscribe button below. And if you have any comments, please leave them in the comment section below. Also let you know that I do have a Patreon page where I provide a lot of longer form videos showing more of these techniques in depth and some good question and answers amongst the Patreons, and looks forward to upcoming projects, little sneak peeks. So check that out if you'd like. And again, thank you for everything and happy modeling.